I came to the Croatian border down a small road in the mountains. I'd been walking for most of the day and I hadn't seen a car yet. The border post was this small little porter cabin baking in the sun, and outside there were two guards standing, surly, all pistols and cigarettes. They looked me up and down. It was the first time that I needed a passport since I crossed the channel several months previously, but I'd get used in the coming months to the same incredulous questions at every border. Where's your car? No, really, where's your car? Why are you walking to Istanbul? When I was finally able to explain in our mix of English and Croatian what it was that I was up to, the border guard did something which I've never experienced before or since on any border. He invited me into his porter cabin, pulled me up a chair, and poured me a toast of his homemade brandy to toast my arrival to his country. Welcome to the East, he said. You will find good people here. In 2010, I walked 8 months from my home in White Parish to Istanbul. It was a journey of about 3,500 miles. It wasn't an easy trip, but it was a deeply rewarding one. And one of the things that made it so, and what I want to talk about today, was the kindness that I experienced from the strangers that I met along the way. The hospitality that I was shown. There was a lady in France that organised in her village for me to stay in the local hotel, or a group at one of the high passes in the Alps that shared their dinner with me because I didn't have any. In Italy, where I was made guest of honour at the village fete, and in Croatia, where I was invited into a small house that was still crippled from the war. In Macedonia, where a farmer that I met was so disgusted by the state of my clothes that he gave me his own trousers. In Istanbul, where some fishermen that I met told me that the only way to see their beautiful city was from the water, and took me out in their boat. Every single day something was offered to me. Someone put their trust in me, a trust that built a connection between two people. And I came back to England with hundreds of stories about how well I've been looked after, how we need to learn as a society to put more trust in strangers, to be more accepting of people we don't know. I could have just spoken about that, but then something else happened. A month after I got back, a family friend was murdered. Murdered by a stranger who she had invited into our house for a drink just before Christmas. It made these stories that I was telling about a world full of kind and gentle strangers seem suddenly incredibly naive. Suddenly I didn't know what to think anymore. Maybe in 8 months of walking I'd just been very, very lucky. It was a cold evening in March just after I set off, when my right ankle decided it was finally had enough. I had a bed arranged for me in a village a few miles down the road, but I was going slower and slower and the pack was getting heavier, my ankle was swelling up and I realised there was no way that I was going to make it. And I sat down by the side of the path feeling ridiculous. London was maybe a 20-minute journey away on the train. I had friends there, I had a warm bed, I could put my feet up for a few days, and suddenly the rules that I'd imposed upon myself when I set out of covering every single step of the journey on foot were seeming increasingly less romantic and exciting. I called up the place where I was meant to be staying and explained the situation to them, and they said, well, we'll come and pick you up. And I gritted my teeth and said, no, thank you, I'll see you tomorrow. And as I hung up, I realised that if I was going to be able to be looked after, I needed to find the help where I was. I needed to find help from whoever was around. And it started to rain. I limped into a pub nearby and sat down by the fire feeling sorry for myself. I ordered a pint and some fish and chips, and slowly as it got to closing time, the crowd thinned out, until eventually it was just me and the barman and the sound of the rain outside. I got chatting to the barman and I told him what I was up to, and he told me, well, sure, he respected it, but he couldn't condone it. The world was a dangerous place and you couldn't trust strangers anymore. It seemed a kind of funny attitude for a barman to have, but then perhaps he'd seen things that I hadn't. Anyway, I was able to say to him about my experiences over the past couple of weeks. There hadn't been that many yet, but I could tell him about the group of strangers in Alton that had got me blindingly drunk on Jägermeister and given me the walking stick which I carried with me all the way to Istanbul, or the vicar who had invited me into his house for dinner. I could say to him that, well, in my experience in the last 2 weeks, I have been able to put my trust in strangers. In fact, more than that, they've been the highlights of my trip. In the end, he ended up giving me my meal on the house and letting me make a bed up in the shed, let me dry out my clothes in the tumble dryer in the morning. And it was vital, these experiences. I'm not talking about the money that it saved me or even the warm beds. What I really needed and what kept me going during the journey was that simple human connection between two people. Being invited into a stranger's house is a feeling of incredible joy. It's hard to describe. The walking was often difficult. There was the exhaustion, the weather, the blisters, and I longed for the sort of comforts that I'd taken for granted at home. Having hot water, a good meal, a conversation. And to know that someone, that a stranger, had recognised that need and had been willing to give that to me was a remarkable feeling. It put me in a feeling of vulnerability, certainly, but it was also a feeling of incredible power. And I remember standing under the shower with the heat turned up to maximum many times with this kind of feeling of delirium that for the next 12 hours I knew that I could relax, I was amongst friends. And the fact that these friends were strangers only served to underline the fact that this was really just about a need for human connection. But I don't want to tell a story about getting something for nothing. In the Bible, the word that is often translated as hospitality is from the Greek philoxenia, which literally translates as a love of strangers. And in a hospitable relationship, this goes both ways, because in a hospitable relationship, each is a stranger unto the other. We share something reciprocal, an exchange, a friendship, a conversation, the age-old human act of two people connecting over a gift. And it goes deeper than that, because when you come to someone as a stranger, you also start to learn about the stranger within yourselves. We meet someone undefined by all the things that we've left back home, undefined by our relationships, our possessions, our preconceptions. And doing that, we allow ourselves to look at the world in a new way, in ways that were previously unimaginable to us. A few years ago, I was living in London. I just finished university just across the road in King's, and I was unsure what I was going to do next. I was pretty sure that I didn't want to be in London anymore, but beyond that, I wasn't really sure. A friend of mine had gone on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela the previous year, and not really having anything better to do, I thought I might as well do the same. So I travelled down to the Pyrenees and I spent a month walking across Spain. Not quite sure why I was doing it. But I was fascinated by the myriad reasons that I met of all the other walkers that were doing the same sort of thing, whether they were devout Catholics, or whether they were just getting fit, or whether they were dealing with a bereavement in the family, or whether they were looking for a cheap holiday. And many people like me weren't quite sure of exactly why they'd chosen to go walking. But like me, they were all intrigued about this kind of space that was opening up within themselves, the things that it was teaching about themselves. And it was this that led me to get interested in pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is a cultural practice that encourages people, sometimes almost requires people to head out into the world in a position of humility, of vulnerability as a stranger. For Muslims, they say that pilgrimage makes everyone equal, as they are in the eyes of God. In Western Europe, by medieval times, 1/10 of the population was either on a pilgrimage to one of the main sites, to Canterbury, to Rome, to Santiago, to Jerusalem, or they were involved in providing for those that were on that pilgrimage. It was big business. It was almost the tourist industry of its day. And it's still big business today. In 2011, there were almost 250,000 people that walked to Santiago de Compostela. I went to Belgium to meet a group called Oikoton, who are a fantastic organisation that work with young people who are in prison, and they give them the chance of being released from prison if they do a walk from Belgium to Santiago with a mentor, which is a walk of about 4 months. I've read in the past about how pilgrimage used to be given out as a kind of sentence for atoning for sins in some way, and I'd assumed it was some kind of banishment. But talking to these teenagers at Oikoton, I started to see the positive aspects that this sort of walking could bring into their lives. It allowed them to get out of a situation which they were stuck in. Maybe they didn't see a situation, they didn't see any other way out of their situation, and it allowed them to head out into the world with only the label of pilgrim, rather than all the negative labels which they had put on them and they had to carry through their lives. I was told a story about 2 teenagers being invited into a house in France at the end of a long day. They were given a television to watch, a good meal, a hot shower, and a chance to go down in the cellar and choose a bottle of wine for dinner. And one of them turned to the owner of the house over dinner and said, "What the hell are you doing, inviting 2 people like us into your house?" He was amazed that people had been able to put that sort of trust in him. And of course, it's not a magic solution. It doesn't mean that these guys are never going to run into problems again in the future. But what it does provide them with is a remarkable set of experiences to draw on if and when that happens. It shows them that other types of change are possible, and it allows them to start to begin to learn about that stranger within themselves. And to me, that is the power of pilgrimage. Yet pilgrimage is changing. 2 million people went to Mecca last year, but many of them fly or take the bus. When I was walking to Santiago, I met many people that are on these kind of pilgrim package tours where you fly to Santiago one day, you fly to Rome the next, you fly to Jerusalem the next, and you're back home in London in time for church on Sunday with every religious box ticked, but I couldn't help somehow missing the point. Oiketon as well, their funders are starting to push them now to make much shorter walks in order to save money. The chances for us to connect with strangers on our journeys are diminishing. And when I was walking through people's villages, I felt almost like some bizarre rare beast, and people would run out of their houses to drag me inside and really eager to share their stories with me and to find out about mine. In 2008, a friend of mine walked barefoot and without money from Edinburgh to London. He was advised by a bishop before he set off that he should ask for nothing except water, to simply tell his story and trust that everything else would follow. To ask, said the bishop, would be robbing people of the chance of offering hospitality. And I can't help feeling that many modern constructions of our world are robbing people of that same chance. We can find everything else out we want now about cultures on Wikipedia. We can get anywhere in the world we want in 24 hours. We don't need strong communities anymore because we've got locked doors. But under this veneer, I feel there is a core of hospitality which is very much alive. And yes, there is a risk. It would be facile to pretend that there isn't. I'm not encouraging reckless behaviour, and I'm not saying everyone in this room should go out and do exactly the same as I have done. It's about knowing your limits as an individual and making your choices just as you would in any aspect of your life. That life itself is a risk and can't be ordered and can't be controlled. But what I am suggesting is that in trying to take all of the risk and all of the danger out of life, we're perversely destroying the sorts of things that truly keep us safe. We're destroying the fact that we can maybe rely on a strong community if we need support. We're destroying the fact that we can trust that we will be looked after by a stranger if we're in a time of need. I feel that in trying to remove out all the risk of life, in fact, all we're doing is making us scared of life's shadows. We shift this pressure, this burden onto ourselves in this never-ending, escalating frenzy of control, where we get increasingly scared of the world outside our window. And risk seems more of an amorphous phantom that looms over everything we do rather than connected to individual events. To me, fear is about not having power, and if we're told the rules of how we have to interact with the world, rather than being able to head out into that world and learn and experience from it, then we're always going to be scared and we're always going to be unsafe. It was just after I started the walk and I was walking through a little village on a Sunday and the bells were ringing for church. It had been years since I'd been to church, but I was on some sort of pilgrimage, albeit a secular one, and it seemed to be appropriate. It turns out that walking into a tiny congregation with an enormous rucksack is a really good way to get a Sunday lunch. And as I was talking over the roast, the daughter of the family, a lawyer who was about to be ordained, I was explaining to her about the reasons that I had for setting out. I talked about what I've been talking about now, about how I felt that our obsession with control was diminishing things, and I wanted to just head out into the world in the most simple way that I knew and see what would happen to me. And she said to me that was how she thought about faith. And that was the idea that I carried with me through the whole trip. Because that is what I think the point of hospitality is. It restores our faith in the world. It lets us feel that we have the humility to go out and we are dependent upon other people, and allows us to believe that we do not have the power to shape and control our lives in the ways that we might think. And it gives us the faith to know that the world will look after us, even if sometimes it might not. Because we never know where hospitality will lead, and it never knows the changes that it will make in us. As it says in Hebrews, forget not to show love unto strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Thank you.